You give a command your dog has followed perfectly for months, and this time there's a delay before anything happens. It's not a refusal, and it's not confusion, because you can see they understood you clearly. There's just a small pause that wasn't there before. And that pause is where the change begins. Most owners ignore that moment because the dog still follows through. The command is completed, so it feels like everything is still working. But the process that leads to that response is already shifted. And behavior is defined by process more than outcome. There was a time when your dog responded instantly without any visible gap between hearing and acting. The response would begin almost as soon as the cue was given. That kind of timing doesn't come from effort, it comes from alignment. And alignment removes hesitation completely. When alignment is strong, your dog doesn't need to think before acting. The signal is processed as a priority, not as an option. There is no comparison between you and the environment. The response simply happens. But when your dog hesitates, that automatic response has been replaced by something else. There is now a moment where your dog is evaluating before they move. It may only last a second, but that second changes everything. Because evaluation introduces choice. Choice is what creates variation in behavior. Even if your dog still responds correctly, the path to that response is no longer stable. One moment they respond quickly, the next moment they take longer. And that inconsistency begins to grow. Now watch closely the next time you give a command in a familiar setting. Notice whether your dog begins moving immediately or if there is a brief stillness first. That stillness is not empty. It is where your dog is processing something else before committing to you. That processing could be environmental, internal, or situational. But the key detail is that it is happening before your signal is acted on. Your cue is no longer first in the sequence. And once that happens, reliability starts to weaken. At first, nothing appears broken. Your dog still listens most of the time. Commands still work in controlled situations. But the consistency that once existed is no longer guaranteed. This is because your dog is no longer responding automatically. They are deciding whether to respond. And decisions can change based on context. Now this same hesitation begins to show up in movement. Your dog starts moving, then adjusts direction afterward instead of aligning first. The correction happens after the action has already begun. And that delay affects precision. When decisions happen after movement begins, behavior becomes less efficient. Your dog is reacting instead of committing. That reaction creates small inconsistencies in timing and direction. And those inconsistencies accumulate. Now take it into a real scenario where your dog is slightly distracted. You give a command, and instead of interrupting what they're doing immediately, they continue for a moment before responding. That continuation is the hesitation expanding. And it shows that your influence has been delayed. Even a small delay gives other factors time to compete. The environment becomes more relevant. Movement becomes more engaging. And your signal becomes one option among many. That's where the real shift happens. Your dog is no longer defaulting to you as the first point of reference. They are balancing your signal against everything else. And balance introduces uncertainty. Now this pattern starts to appear in engagement as well. Your dog checks the environment before checking in with you. They move slightly further before adjusting to your direction. And they take longer to reconnect after distraction. Each of these changes seems small on its own. But they are all driven by the same underlying shift. Your dog is no longer anchored to you first. They are evaluating before aligning. Evaluation always takes time. Even if that time is only a fraction of a second. And that fraction is enough to change how behavior unfolds. That's why hesitation matters more than the final response. Because the response might still happen correctly. But the structure behind it is no longer stable. And instability spreads. Now consider recall in this context. When you call your dog, you are asking for an immediate shift in priority. You are asking them to disengage from everything else and move toward you. That only works when your signal is processed first. If hesitation exists, that priority shift is delayed. Your dog hears you, but something else is processed before they act. And that delay affects distance, timing, and outcome. Which is why recall begins to feel inconsistent. It's not that your dog doesn't understand the command. It's that the command is no longer the first thing acted on. Something else is being weighed before it. And that changes how reliable the response feels. Over time, this hesitation becomes more noticeable. What started as a 1-second delay becomes a pattern. Your dog begins to pause in more situations. And the pauses begin to last longer. This is how the shift spreads. Not through failure, but through repetition of a new sequence. The more your dog evaluates before responding, the more that pattern becomes normal. and normal behavior becomes automatic again. But now the automatic behavior includes hesitation. And that's where consistency is lost. Because hesitation introduces variation every time it appears. And variation breaks reliability. That's why the moment your dog hesitates matters so much. It's not just a delay. It's the first visible sign that your dog is no longer responding the way they used to. And that change is already in progress. Once you understand that, the behavior stops feeling random. It becomes predictable. You can see where it starts and how it spreads. And that clarity changes how you interpret everything your dog does. Because the hesitation you see now is not the problem itself. It is the result of a deeper shift that has already taken place. And once you recognize it, you begin to understand the process behind the behavior. That process is what determines how your dog will respond moving forward. Not the command, not the environment, but the sequence happening before action. And when that sequence changes, everything built on it changes too. What makes this shift harder to notice is that your dog is still responding enough to feel reliable most of the time. The behavior hasn't failed, it has just changed shape underneath. That's why it often goes unaddressed for so long. And by the time it becomes obvious, the pattern is already established. Now your dog is operating with a different internal sequence. They are no longer moving from immediate alignment. They are moving from delayed commitment. And delayed commitment always creates variation. This begins to affect how your dog interprets new situations. Instead of defaulting to you, they begin to reference the environment first. That reference point slowly becomes their primary guide. And you become secondary. That doesn't feel dramatic in a single moment. But across multiple situations, it changes everything. Because consistency depends on a stable starting point. And that starting point is now shifted. Now your dog is not just responding differently to commands. They are processing everything differently before responding at all. The environment holds more weight. Movement holds more interest. And once that happens, your signals have to compete instead of led. They are no longer acted on immediately. They are evaluated against everything else happening in that moment. And evaluation takes time. That time changes behavior in ways that are hard to see at first. It shows up as hesitation, delay, and subtle inconsistency. But underneath, it's a complete shift in sequence. And sequence defines reliability. Now take a step back and think about how often this happens throughout a normal day. Small pauses before movement. Slight delays before response. Brief moments where your dog seems to check something before acting. Each of those moments is part of the same pattern. They are not isolated behaviors. They are connected by the same internal process. And that process is already changed. Once that process becomes consistent, the hesitation becomes normal. Your dog begins to operate this way by default. And what used to be automatic alignment becomes conditional response. That's where the real difference lies. Because conditional response depends on context. It depends on what else is happening in that moment. And that makes behavior harder to predict. Even if your dog still understands everything you ask. That's why the second your dog hesitates is so important. It's not about that single moment. It's about what that moment represents. A shift that has already taken place beneath the surface. And once you see that, the behavior becomes clear. Not confusing, not random, but structured. Because every delay follows the same pattern. And every pattern starts somewhere small.